Have you ever imagined being alone at work, late at night, and something inexplicable happening? Today, we're going to explore 7 real horror stories involving exactly that situation. Being in the workplace, alone, and in the dead of night. Scary tales that will make you think twice before working overtime. So leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss out on any chilling content. Shall we begin? 1. The Living Archive. Night fell over Edinburgh, Scotland, as the piercing winds whistled through the cobbled streets. In the heart of the city, in a dark stone Victorian building, stood the National Archives, a place where time seemed to have stood still. Between labyrinthine corridors and shelves that rose to the ceiling, Henry Wallace worked alone. He was a dedicated, meticulous, and above all, lonely archivist. The nights were his constant companions, and he preferred the silence of dawn to the bustle of the day. On that particular night, Henry was immersed in cataloguing forgotten historical documents. The clock struck midnight when he heard it for the first time. A low, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper. He raised his head abruptly, his eyes scanning the empty room. "It must be the wind," he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the shiver that ran down his spine. But the whispers continued, faint at first, as if someone was talking from across the room. He stood up slowly, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor as he followed the sound. The shelves seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, and the dim light from the lamps created dancing shadows that played with his imagination. "Who's there?" he asked aloud, his voice sounding strangely small in the vast space. No answer came beyond the continuous sound of whispers. They seemed to be coming from a specific section, the old criminal files wing. Henry hesitated for a moment before moving on. When he reached the shelf from which the sounds were emanating, he noticed something strange. A file was out of place, as if it had been partially pulled out by invisible hands. He picked it up carefully and read the title, Case 7845, The Disappearance of Margaret Hensley. It was an unsolved case from the 1920s about a young woman who had mysteriously disappeared after going out to a dance. As Henry flipped through the weathered pages, the whispers grew louder. They were clearer now, indistinct words, but charged with urgency. He felt a growing pressure in his mind, as if something or someone was trying to guide him to a long-buried truth. "Margaret," he muttered as he read the details of the case. The last person to see her alive had been a man called Edward Blackwood, an influential local businessman who had never been formally charged due to a lack of evidence. However, rumors about his involvement persisted for decades. The whispers became louder and more insistent, echoing around them like voices coming from the shelves themselves. Henry felt his heart racing as an oppressive sensation took hold of him. It was as if the archive itself was alive, demanding justice. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out completely. Henry was immersed in total darkness for a few seconds before a dim light began to shine at the end of the corridor. Trembling with fear and curiosity, he walked slowly towards the source of the light. On the floor was another open file, this one detailing another unsolved case involving Edward Blackwood, the suspicious death of a journalist investigating the disappearance of Margaret Hensley. The coincidences were too disturbing to ignore. Henry began to connect the dots between the cases as the voices around him seemed to guide his thoughts. He realized that the archives were not just passive records. They held fragments of the souls of those whose stories had been forgotten by earthly justice. But then came the most terrifying moment of the night. One of the voices became crystal clear and whispered directly into his ear, "You must reveal the truth, or you will be silenced." Henry instinctively stepped back, but stumbled and fell to the cold floor. When he looked up, he saw something he would never forget. A translucent figure hovering between the shelves, a young woman with sad eyes and a pleading expression. It was Margaret Hensley. She pointed to another file on the shelf above him before disappearing like smoke in the wind. Trembling uncontrollably, Henry reached for the indicated file and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was incriminating evidence against Edward Blackwood, financial documents that directly linked the businessman to the scene of Margaret's disappearance. The archivist knew he had discovered something monumental, but he also realized the danger it represented for himself. The voices were now shouting in unison, "Reveal or perish." Wasting no time, Henry scanned the documents and sent them anonymously to local investigative journalists before fleeing the building that very night. He never returned to the National Archives. Days later, the headlines exploded with revelations about Edward Blackwood and his crimes that had been covered up for almost a century. But Henry knew he would never be completely safe. The voices had stopped since then, but he could still feel their invisible eyes watching him in the shadows. The National Archives remained there, silent as ever. But Henry knew the truth. Those corridors held more than old papers. They held living secrets that demanded to be unearthed, whatever the cost. 2. The endless elevator. London, with its grey skies and busy streets, seemed indifferent to the loneliness of those who worked in the dead of night. Emily Carter, a night receptionist in a commercial building in the heart of the city, was used to the oppressive silence that took over after work. The building, a modern glass and steel tower, was practically deserted after 10 p.m. Only the distant sound of traffic and the hum of fluorescent lights filled the empty corridors. That night, however, something seemed different. Ever since she had arrived for her shift, Emily had felt an inexplicable discomfort, as if she were being watched. She tried to ignore the feeling as she organized papers at reception and checked the security monitors. The cameras showed only empty floors and dark corridors. Nothing out of the ordinary. Around midnight, Emily decided to get a coffee from the machine in the cafeteria on the 7th floor. She took the elevator as usual, pressing the corresponding button. The doors closed softly and the elevator began its ascent. But halfway up, it stopped abruptly on the 4th floor. The doors opened with a metallic sound. The corridor ahead was completely empty, lit only by the cold light of fluorescent lamps. Emily frowned. No one was supposed to be there at that hour. Technical problem, she thought, trying to dispel the unease that was growing in her chest. She pressed the button for the 7th floor again. The doors closed slowly, but before the elevator began to rise again, Emily saw something out of the corner of her eye, a shadow moving quickly down the empty corridor. Her heart raced. She frantically pressed the door close button until they finally sealed. The elevator went up to the 7th floor without any further interruptions. Emily hurried out and grabbed her coffee, trying to calm her nerves. "It was just my imagination," she muttered to herself as she walked back to the elevator. But when she got in again and pressed the button for the 1st floor, something strange happened. The elevator started to descend, but it didn't stop at the 1st floor. It continued to descend beyond the known levels of the building. The control panel showed negative numbers: -1, -2, -3. Emily felt panic take hold of her. Finally, the doors opened onto a floor that shouldn't have existed. The space ahead was dark and damp, with raw concrete walls and a strong, musty smell in the air. She stood paralyzed for a moment before desperately pressing the button to close the doors. The elevator went up again, but now it seemed to have a mind of its own. It stopped randomly on floors where no one should be. On the 9th floor, the doors opened to reveal an indistinct figure at the end of the corridor, tall and motionless like a statue. On the 12th floor, figures seemed to move in the shadows, disappearing as soon as Emily tried to focus on them. She broke out in a cold sweat as she tried to stay calm. "This is some kind of nightmare," she repeated to herself in a low voice. Finally, when the doors opened again on the 1st floor, or at least that's what the panel indicated. Emily rushed out to the reception. But something was wrong. The room looked different. The furniture was out of place, the clocks ticked at impossible times, and the cameras displayed distorted images on the monitors. Desperate to get out of there, she ran to the main door of the building, only to discover that it was locked from the inside. No key or card would work to open it. She tried to call for help on the landline at reception, but the line was dead. Emily decided to return to the elevator in the hope of finding some way out on the upper floors. But when she entered again and pressed any button at random, she realized that the numbers on the panel were now completely scrambled. Strange symbols had replaced the traditional numbers. The elevator began to go up and down without stopping, as if it were stuck in an infinite loop. Each time the doors opened, she saw more disturbing scenes, corridors deformed like impossible labyrinths, faceless human figures, indecipherable whispers echoing through the empty floors. The sense of time began to disappear for Emily. She no longer knew how long she had been trapped in that mechanical nightmare. Hours, days. With each elevator stop, her sanity seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. Finally, when the doors opened once again on the first floor, or so it seemed, she staggered out to find that everything was exactly as it had been before. The reception, spotless, the monitors working normally, and the clocks ticking 6 a.m., the time her shift would end. Emily looked around in disbelief as the first employees began to arrive at the building with unconcerned expressions. No one seemed to notice her state of shock or her crumpled, dirty clothes. She had never told anyone about that terrifying night. Who would believe her? But every time she looked at the elevator during her next few shifts, she felt a chill run down her spine. Something in that building was wrong, and she knew it wouldn't be the last time someone faced the endless elevator. 3. The locked room. It was a cold night in Berlin, and the icy wind seemed to blow through the concrete walls of the old commercial building where Klaus Müller worked as a night watchman. The building, built in the 1970s, looked austere and functional, with endless corridors and basements that seemed to plunge into the heart of the earth. Klaus was used to the solitude of his nightly rounds, but that night, something seemed different. As he walked through the underground corridors, checking doors and locks, he noticed something he had never seen before, a metal door at the end of a narrow, dimly lit corridor. It looked weathered, with peeling paint and rusty hinges. Klaus frowned. He knew the building well and was certain that this room was not on the building maps. Curious, he tried to open the door, but it was locked. However, as he touched the handle, he felt a chill run through his body, as if something inside the room was waiting for him. Determined to investigate, he returned to his security room and took out a bunch of master keys. When he returned to the corridor, he noticed that the air there seemed heavier, almost suffocating. With some hesitation, Klaus inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked loudly as it opened, revealing a dark, claustrophobic space. He switched on his flashlight and slowly entered. What he saw made his heart race. The room was full of personal belongings strewn across the floor, broken watches, worn-out shoes, notebooks with pages torn out, and photographs yellowed by time. Klaus knelt down to examine one of the photos and felt a chill when he realized it was of a young woman with a shy smile. On the back of the photo was written, "Anna Weiss, disappeared in 1984. He picked up another photo, this time of an older man with a serious expression. The back read, "Johann Kruger, disappeared in 1992. There were dozens of similar photos scattered around the room, all of people who had disappeared over the decades. Klaus felt his stomach churn as he tried to process what this meant. As he illuminated the rest of the room with his flashlight, he noticed something even more disturbing. The walls seemed to be covered in scratched marks, as if someone had tried desperately to get out of there. The marks formed chaotic patterns that seemed to move when he looked away. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut, making him jump in fright. He ran to it and tried to open it again, but it was locked from the inside. "This isn't possible," he muttered as he pulled hard on the handle. It was then that he noticed something even stranger. The room seemed to be changing shape. The walls began to slowly move closer together, as if they were alive and trying to swallow him up. The air became denser, making it harder to breathe. Klaus tried to remain calm as he looked for another way out. He searched every corner of the room with his flashlight until he found a small opening in the bottom corner of one of the walls. It was too narrow to pass through, but he could feel a current of cold air coming from it, a sign that there might be another way out. As he tried to widen the opening with his bare hands, he heard a low, guttural sound coming from the back of the room. He turned quickly and saw something that froze his blood. A dark silhouette emerging from the shadows. The figure was tall and indistinct, as if made of solid smoke. It had no discernible face, but its eyes shone with a cold, opaque light. Klaus instinctively backed away as the figure slowly advanced towards him. He shouted for help, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the living walls of the room. Desperate, he began banging on the door with all his might as the figure drew ever closer. When all seemed lost, he remembered the radio on his belt and tried to call someone on the building's security frequency, but all he heard was static, followed by a low, threatening whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Suddenly, the lantern lights began to flash frantically before going out completely. Klaus was immersed in total darkness as he felt the presence of the figure hovering over him. And then silence. Hours later, or perhaps minutes, he couldn't tell, Klaus woke up in the basement corridor, exactly where he had first found the door. But now it was completely gone. There was no sign of the room or the personal belongings he had seen inside. Confused and terrified, he ran to the security monitors to check the recordings from that night, but the cameras in the basement showed only static for the entire time he was away. Klaus was never able to explain what happened that night or where he was taken by the locked room. But since then, he has avoided patrolling the underground corridors alone, because he knew that something was still down there, waiting for the next person curious enough to open that time-forgotten door. If you're enjoying the stories so far, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps my work and ensures that you don't miss out on any spooky content like this. Shall we continue? The call of the basement. Dense fog hung over Hamburg that night, enveloping the port city in an eerie blanket of silence. In the industrial district, where abandoned factories lined up like skeletons from a bygone era, Hans Bauer, an experienced maintenance technician, drove his old van towards an unusual call. A real estate company trying to revitalize an old textile mill had hired him to investigate electrical faults in the basement of the building. Hans was a practical man, used to going into places forgotten by time and solving problems that no one else wanted to tackle. But something about that job bothered him. The factory, built at the beginning of the 20th century, had a dark reputation. Local stories spoke of mysterious disappearances and unexplained sounds coming from underground. Hans didn't believe in superstition, but he couldn't deny the oppressive weight he felt when he parked his van in front of the building. With a flashlight and his toolbox in hand, he entered through the rusty main door, which creaked loudly as it was opened. The interior of the factory was plunged into darkness, with only the beams of light from the flashlight illuminating the way. The air smelled of mold and rust, and the sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. Following the instructions he had received, Hans found the stairs leading down to the basement. Each step creaked under his weight, as if protesting against his presence. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he switched on his flashlight and illuminated the space in front of him. The basement was vast and cold, with raw concrete walls covered in dark stains that he preferred not to examine closely. He quickly located the faulty electrical panel and got to work. As he adjusted the frayed wires and checked the fuses, he heard a low sound coming from the bottom of the basement. Soft footsteps, as if someone was walking barefoot on the rough concrete. Hans stopped and looked around carefully. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. There was no reply. Trying to ignore his growing discomfort, he went back to work. But the footsteps continued, closer now. He quickly turned the flashlight towards the sound, but all he saw was dense darkness that seemed to swallow up the light. It was then that he noticed something on the nearby walls. Handprints. They were scattered irregularly, some as large as those of an adult, others too small to be those of any grown-up person. The marks looked fresh, the outlines still clear in the accumulated dust. Hans felt a shiver run up his spine as he examined the marks more closely. Some seemed to have been scratched into the concrete surface with enough force to leave deep furrows. He tried to push away the disturbing thoughts that were beginning to form in his mind and went back to finish the repair quickly. But the atmosphere seemed to conspire against him. The air became heavier and colder, making it difficult to breathe. A low, rhythmic sound began to echo through the basement, an indistinct murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Hans tried to rationalize. "It must be the wind coming through the pipes," he said aloud to himself. When he had finally finished repairing the electrical panel, he got up and hurried out of the oppressive place. But as he lighted the way to the stairs again, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. Strange symbols scratched into the concrete floor. They formed an irregular circle with intricate geometric patterns in the center. Hans felt his heart racing as he tried to understand what he was seeing. He had heard of these symbols in local stories. They were associated with ancient rituals performed by obscure cults in the region during past decades. Suddenly, the murmuring increased in intensity until it turned into muffled screams that seemed to come from the basement walls themselves. Hans instinctively backed away as he scanned the space with his flashlight in panic. That's when he saw it, an indistinct figure standing in the far corner of the basement. It was tall and stooped, with vague outlines, as if shrouded in a pulsating black mist. Before he could react, the lantern lights flickered and went out completely. Hans was immersed in total darkness as the screams turned into distorted, deafening laughter all around him. He ran blindly towards the stairs, tripping over his own feet as he felt something cold brush against his skin. When he finally reached the staircase and ran up to the surface, he left the factory panting and in a cold sweat despite the freezing night temperature. He got into the van without looking back and sped away. Over the next few days, Hans tried to forget that terrifying experience. But something kept haunting his thoughts. As he ran to escape from the basement that last night, he was sure he heard a clear voice among the screams and laughter, a voice whispering his name. He never told anyone about what happened in that abandoned factory, but he knew that something evil still inhabited that forgotten basement, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor who dared to cross its path. 5. The stopped clock. It was a cold dawn in Tokyo, and the city lights shone like artificial stars on the horizon. On the 22nd floor of a corporate building in the Shinjuku district, Akiko Tanaka was working alone, revising overdue reports. The silence of the office was broken only by the soft sound of her computer keys and the distant hum of the ventilation system. Akiko was known for her dedication to her work, often staying late to meet impossible deadlines. But that night, something seemed out of the ordinary. As she typed, she noticed that the digital clock on the wall in front of her had stopped. It read exactly 3:33 in the morning. Frowning, Akiko checked her wristwatch, but was surprised to see that it too had stopped at the same time. Trying to ignore the discomfort that was beginning to grow, she picked up her cell phone to check the time, but the screen displayed only a dull glow without any sign of life. "It must be an electrical problem," she muttered to herself. trying to rationalize the situation. But when she looked around the office, she noticed something even stranger. All the analog and digital clocks were stopped at the same exact time. It was as if time had frozen at that instant. Trying to concentrate on her work, Akiko turned her attention back to the computer screen. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her heart race. A dark figure standing in the corner of the room. She quickly turned her chair to look directly at it, but there was no one there. Taking a deep breath, she tried to convince herself that it was just her mind playing tricks due to tiredness. However, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. She felt invisible eyes fixed on her back as she typed. Shortly afterwards, she heard a faint sound coming from the meeting room next door, as if someone was dragging a chair across the floor. Akiko hesitated before getting up and walking slowly to the door of the room. When she opened it, she found the space empty, but the chairs were all turned in the opposite direction to the meeting table, as if they had been rearranged by invisible hands. A shiver ran down her spine as she slowly retreated to her desk. As she sat down again, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Another figure was now standing in the opposite corner of the room. This time, it was clearer, a tall, motionless silhouette with vague, indistinct outlines. Akiko tried to scream, but no sound came from her throat. Her eyes were fixed on the figure as she desperately tried to pick up her cell phone again. But when she looked away for a brief second to reach the device on the table and looked back to the corner, the figure had disappeared. Panic seized her as she scanned the office for any sign of that disturbing presence. It was then that she realized that the figures weren't just in the corners. They were now reflected in the mirrored surfaces of the windows and the screens of the disconnected computers. Each reflection showed a different figure, some tall and thin, others small and curvy, all motionless, but with their faces turned directly towards her. Akiko felt tears welling up in her eyes as she tried to find a logical explanation for what was happening. "This isn't real," she repeated to herself in a low voice, like a desperate mantra. Suddenly, all the lights in the office flickered violently before going out completely. Darkness overtook the room as Akiko was paralyzed by a mixture of fear and disbelief. Then came the sound, a loud, irregular ticking that echoed through the empty space as if dozens of invisible clocks were running at the same time. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, growing in intensity until it completely filled his ears. When the lights came back on abruptly a few seconds later, Akiko saw something she would never forget. The figures were now scattered all over the office, dozens of them, standing between the desks and chairs, like faceless human statues. She didn't wait another second to find out what would happen next. She hurriedly grabbed her things and ran out of the building without looking back. The next morning, when her colleagues arrived at the office, they found everything exactly as it should have been, except for the digital and analog clocks still stopped at 3:33 a.m. Akiko never returned to work in that building. She resigned the same day and has avoided passing through Shinjuku ever since. But even far from there, every time she looked at a digital clock in the early hours of the morning and saw the numbers 3:33 flashing on the screen, she felt like she was being watched again by the still figures of that terrifying night. 6. The Burning Machine. It was a cold, silent night in Manchester, England, when Tom Grayson arrived for his shift at the old foundry where he worked. The building, a red brick structure with weather-beaten windows, was a relic of a bygone industrial era. The factory operated with minimal staff during the early hours, and that night, Tom was alone, in charge of supervising the incinerator, an ancient and imposing machine that seemed to have a mind of its own. The incinerator was used to destroy industrial waste, but its intimidating appearance and the oppressive heat emanating from it made it almost a living entity. Tom had never liked that job, but the bills didn't pay for themselves. He sighed as he put on his goggles and turned on the machine, which responded with a low, steady roar. The first few hours of the night were quiet. Tom fed the incinerator with the usual waste, discarded pieces of metal, scraps of building materials, and other industrial debris. But at around 2 a.m., something unusual caught his eye. When he removed the ashes from the lower compartment of the machine, he found something that shouldn't have been there, a partially melted gold ring. He held it between his gloved fingers, observing the delicate design and the remains of a precious stone embedded in the center. "This isn't industrial waste," he muttered to himself. Intrigued, he continued to rummage through the ashes and found more personal items. A wristwatch with a burnt bracelet, a pair of earrings deformed by the heat, and even fragments of charred fabric that looked like clothing. Tom felt a shiver run down his spine. "What's going on here?" he asked aloud, although he didn't expect an answer. He tried to rationalize the find. Perhaps someone had thrown personal items in the trash by mistake. But as the night progressed, the objects became more disturbing. Among the burnt debris, he found something that made his stomach turn, a metal button attached to a piece of scorched fabric that looked like it belonged to an expensive coat. And next to it, what looked like a gold chain with a pendant. Tom began to feel the weight of the silence around him. The constant sound of the incinerator seemed louder than ever, as if it were mocking him. He looked around the dimly lit room and realized for the first time how oppressive the environment seemed. The soot-covered walls seemed to close in on him. It was then that he heard something, a low, muffled sound coming from the opposite side of the room, as if someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. Tom froze for a moment before grabbing his flashlight and hesitantly walking towards the sound. When he illuminated the dark corner of the room, he saw nothing but the shadows cast by the old machines. But the sound was still there. Closer now. He turned quickly towards the incinerator and felt his heart race when he saw an indistinct shadow moving near the upper compartment of the machine. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty room. No reply. Tom felt cold sweat trickle down his forehead as he slowly approached the incinerator. When he got close enough to look inside the compartment where the waste was deposited, he saw something he would never forget. Between the crackling flames was something that looked like human bones. He instinctively stepped back, almost tripping over his own feet. "This can't be real," he muttered, as he tried to process what he was seeing. It was then that it all made sense. Someone was using the incinerator to dispose of bodies. The personal belongings were the remains of the victims, fragments left behind through carelessness or perhaps as a kind of macabre warning. Tom felt the adrenaline rush as he ran to get his radio and call for help. But when he tried to call the night supervisor, all he heard was static. He tried again several times to no avail. Suddenly, the lights in the room began to flicker violently before going out completely. The only sound was the constant roar of the incinerator and slow footsteps echoing across the floor behind him. Tom turned around quickly with the flashlight trembling in his hands. In the weak beam of light, he saw a dark figure standing near the door, tall and motionless like a statue. Before he could say or do anything, the lights abruptly came back on, but the figure had disappeared. Without a second thought, Tom ran out of the room and through the corridors until he reached the factory's main exit. When he finally stepped out into the cold, early morning air, he stopped to catch his breath as he looked back. That night, he decided never to return to that factory. The next day, he handed in his letter of resignation without giving detailed explanations. Despite this, the questions continued to haunt his mind. Who was using the machine? How many victims had been burned there? And why did he feel as if he was still being watched, even far away from that place? Tom never got any answers, but he knew that the incinerator held secrets too dark to be revealed in the light of day. 7. The invisible visitor. It was an ordinary early morning in Chicago, and the piercing wind whistled through the deserted streets. On the 18th floor of an imposing commercial building, Marcus Hayes, an experienced night security guard, was making his usual rounds. The work was monotonous, but he liked the silence and solitude, a welcome break from the chaos of everyday life. His main task was to monitor the security cameras and make sure no one broke into the building. In the control room, Marcus settled into the swivel chair as he watched the monitors that displayed images of empty corridors, dimly lit stairwells, and silent offices. He was sipping his coffee when something caught his eye. On the monitor of the 14th floor camera, an indistinct figure seemed to be walking slowly down the corridor. Frowning, he leaned closer to the screen. It was difficult to make out details, but it seemed to be someone wearing dark clothes. "Who the hell would be here at this hour?" he muttered to himself. He checked the building's entry register, but there was no one other than him in the system. Grabbing his flashlight and radio, Marcus decided to investigate. He took the elevator up to the 14th floor and cautiously stepped out into the fluorescent-lit corridor. The air was too still, almost suffocating. He walked slowly, checking every corner, but found nothing out of place. "It must be a camera error," he thought as he walked back to the control room. But when he sat down again to look at the monitors, the figure reappeared, this time on the 12th floor. Marcus felt a shiver run down his spine. The person seemed to be walking aimlessly through the corridors, but something about the way they moved was strange. Her steps were slow and deliberate, as if she was waiting to be noticed. He picked up the radio and tried to call the night supervisor at the external security center. "Central, this is Marcus Hayes at the North Point building. I'm seeing something strange on the cameras. Someone is walking around the lower floors, but I can't locate him personally." The reply came with static. "Copy, Marcus. Are you sure? There are no entry logs other than yours." "I'm sure," he replied firmly. "I'll check again." This time, he decided to take the stairs to avoid wasting time in the elevator. When he reached the 12th floor, he felt the air freeze as if an invisible current was passing through him. The corridor was empty again, but something felt wrong, as if the space had subtly changed since the last time he had been there. As he walked down the corridor in search of clues, he heard a low sound behind him, light, rhythmic footsteps. He turned quickly with his flashlight in hand, but there was no one there. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered as he tried to keep calm. He decided to go back to the control room one more time. When he got there and looked at the monitors again, his heart almost stopped. The figure was now in the control room, exactly where he had been sitting seconds before. Marcus instantly turned to look around the room, but it was empty. Sweat began to bead on his forehead as he tried to understand what was happening. It was then that he realized something even more disturbing. On the monitors of the cameras showing other floors, he could see reflections of the figure in mirrored surfaces, windows, glass doors, as if it were there, but invisible to the naked eye. He began to feel that he was not alone in the control room. The air seemed heavier. His instinct screamed at him to get out of there immediately. But before he could take any action, the lights flickered violently before going out completely. The only illumination came from the camera monitors, which now showed distorted and grainy images. Suddenly, he heard a low, guttural sound behind him, heavy, irregular breathing. He turned quickly, with his flashlight trembling in his hands, but there was nothing there. "Who's there?" he shouted in desperation. No answer came apart from the growing sound of breathing that seemed to fill the whole room. Marcus ran out of the control room and down the stairs as fast as he could until he reached the first floor. When he finally came out of the building into the cold, early morning air, he stood still for a few minutes, trying to catch his breath and process what had just happened. The next day, he asked for a transfer to another job without giving detailed explanations. But even away from that building, he could never forget that terrifying night. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes to go to sleep, he could still hear that heavy breathing, as if the invisible visitor had never really left. And those were the 7 horror stories involving being alone at work at night. So, what did you think? Which of these stories gave you the creeps? Tell us in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and share it with that friend who loves a good scare. Until next time, and be careful when you're alone at work. You never know what might happen.